Her husband, Joe, is an intellectual property attorney who specializes in technology. Heidi will be speaking about the association between teen drug use and adult mental illness. To illustrate this association, she co-wrote a story with her brother, which is inspired by his true life as a homeless drug addict with schizophrenia who went to jail 18 times. It's called A Night in Jail. It has been made into a short film and will be staged as reading this January. The novella is available on Amazon. It's wonderful to have Heidi Swan.
Thank you, Faye. Oh. Thank you so much for having me. When I was 12 years old, I had my first drink and I had my first experience with marijuana. A couple years later, I was with one of my best friends, and we were high, and we were in the family room of my house, and all of a sudden, I forgot where I was, and I forgot who I was with. And then I remembered, and then I forgot, and then I remembered. And this went on for quite some time, so marijuana was not my favorite thing to do. It was, however, my brother's favorite thing to do. He also started getting high when he was about my age. And for him, it was like being in the fun house. He would get high and he would curl up on his bed and the room would spin. Or he would sit there and stare at his lava lamp for a long period of time. But even though he was getting high just a little bit every day, it wasn't his whole life. This was a young man who had great ambition. He studied really hard in school. He got good grades. He had plans to go to college and beyond. He had friends. He had girlfriends. He played sports. We went to church as a family. We traveled as a family. There was a lot of involvement for him. So it was just a small portion of his life. And he and I always thought that our teen use of drugs and alcohol was just what teenagers do, that this was a rite of passage, normal, and harmless fun. That is until about 2010, when research started coming out about the teenage brain. So many of you may know this already, but I'm going to go ahead and ask, who knows when the brain stops developing? Mid-20s? Yeah, mid-20s. So prior to this, people thought that a brain was pretty well developed by the teen years, but that's not actually the case. Dr. Francis Jensen, a neuroscientist and author of the 2015 best-selling book, The Teenage Brain, says that a teenage brain is two things at once, and it's really unique, and it will never be unique like this ever again. It is both more powerful and more vulnerable than at virtually any other time in our lives. So teenagers learn things really, really fast, as we know. That's because the brain is forming and all of these neurons are firing. It's called neuroplasticity. So if the brain is interrupted in this development that it's going to continue to do until the age of 25 with drugs or with alcohol, it can harm the forming of a brain. So imagine two houses next to each other. One is a fully formed house. It's made of brick, it's got windows, doors, a roof, a sidewalk, and then next to it is a house that's just got the frame and a little bit of parts around it, but not fully covered. And then imagine a hurricane comes through. How do they fare? Because that is what it's like when you introduce a substance to the brains. The adult brain is fine, maybe a little bit sick the next day, but it's okay. But to a house that's not formed, it can devastate its development. In fact, last year, the Scientific American said that THC, that's the active ingredient in marijuana, disruption on an adolescent brain can cause permanent impairment. So let's talk about what these impairments are. The first thing is that Dr. Jensen says that teenagers get addicted to anything faster and stronger than an adult. So if you have, they did MRI scans of a teenager having nicotine and an adult, and the teenage brain was lit up all over the place. And so that's what it's, whereas the adult brain is a little bit, but not like it is in the teenage brain. So any substance on a teenage brain can set this person up for a lifetime of struggles with addiction. A lot of people say, well, marijuana is not addictive. The National Institute on Drug Abuse says that 50% of all teenagers who use THC every day will become addicted, and 17% of all teenagers who try it will also become addicted. There are also academic consequences to using marijuana and alcohol on a regular basis. Lowered grade point average, that's because those substances make it difficult to create long-term memories in the brain, especially the adolescent brain. Pot is also associated with amotivational syndrome, and that's where the things that you used to be excited about, getting a good grade on a test, playing well in your sports, getting ready to go to college, these things matter much, much less, and they don't really care so much anymore. Also, poor outcomes in adult life overall. But what alarmed me the most about these recent discoveries about the teenage brain is they said that teen marijuana use is associated with adult mental illness. So not every teenager who consumes a THC product is going to get a mental illness. But that's like saying not every teenager who smokes a cigarette is going to get cancer. It's true, not everyone will be afflicted, but it is our duty to warn them that this is a risk. So there's about 30 years worth of studies on this correlation. However, I will give you a brief overview with some recent citations, and on our website, anightinjail.com, under the menu page research, there are links to these studies and articles, except for Dr. Jensen's book. We have to get that separately. So Dr. Jensen says that teenagers who use cannabis daily double their risk for psychosis and schizophrenia. They are also twice as vulnerable to anxiety and depression. The Warwick School of Medicine in the United Kingdom published the first study last November of its kind, which showed that teen cannabis use to be an independent risk factor for bipolar disorder. That means you take every other risk factor away, and if all you did was smoke pot 2 to 3 times a week, you have raised your risk to become bipolar. The state of Colorado last January issued their report from 2015, and they showed that in tandem with commercialization and legalization, suicide rates rose alongside. The most vulnerable were 10 to 19-year-olds. Of those 10 to 19-year-olds who successfully killed themselves, 9 out of 11 had marijuana in their system. So, after our teen substance use, how did things play out for me and my brother? I got through high school just fine. I do have very distinct memories of being much smarter when I was in grade school. I wound up going to college at the University of Washington, and I studied drama there, and I had a low-grade anxiety. And I went on and I worked professionally in New York and Los Angeles as an actress, and my anxiety ebbed and flowed depending on personal circumstances. And I ended up having tremendous anxiety about 20 years ago and wasn't able to perform well in my auditions for jobs, and my agents fired me and the casting director stopped seeing me. So it was sad to lose that. My brother continued to smoke pot through college and graduate school, and by the time he finished graduate school, he had to take his exams, and he wasn't able to pass his exams. He also finished in the bottom third of his class in graduate school. So what he did have was not a job, but an addiction to marijuana, which transferred seamlessly to crack, and in short order, he was homeless and in jail, addicted, dealing drugs, and with schizophrenia, which we didn't know at the time. For those years, our family didn't know where he was or what he was doing. He was, for all intents and purposes, just lost to us. We were able to wrangle him in to do a formal intervention, and we begged and we pleaded with him for 5 hours to give up drugs and to go into treatment. And if I can tell you what he looked like, he was covered in a film of dirt. He had long, scraggly hair. His gums were purple and barely hanging on to his teeth. His nails were long and yellow. He smelled horrible. His clothes were like cardboard. It is so hard to see a person like that outside, and I know we all see them all the time. But when it's your brother, it's even that much more devastating. Well, he refused treatment, and he walked out after 5 hours. And after that, we just prayed that he would be in jail, because then we figured he would be safe. So did our teen use of drugs have anything to do with our adult outcomes? We may never know. But I can tell you that looking at 30 years of research on the matter, it didn't help us. And I can tell you that both of us wish that we had never, ever tried it. So thankfully, after many, many years, my brother did finally get off the streets. He got out of jail. He got treatment for his schizophrenia, and it's a long and agonizing story how that all happened. And if you're interested, there is an article in our website at nightingale.com under backstory, which goes into the details of how he got off the streets and into treatment. But with the psychiatric medication, he was able to see how sick he had been for those 20 years. He was in his late 40s at this point, and he just became despondent over everything, his insanity, what he'd lost in his life. So with the medication, I mean, all of a sudden, he felt isolated and more depressed. Eventually, our mother invited him to move in with her in the desert in California, and that was really wonderful of her, because she is elderly and not particularly strong. But and even though my brother was medicated, he was still struggling with sobriety, and he was still a seriously mentally ill adult living in her home. But because she took such good care of him, he and I had the luxury to have conversations about what his life was like when he was living in the streets. What was he thinking all that time, and what it was like for him in jail as well. What he told me was horrible and fascinating all at the same time. So he thought he was John the Baptist living outside, and that he had to do it because God wanted him to. He also thought that he had a chip planted in him by the CIA, and they were following him 24 hours a day. He and I were having these conversations around the same time that the research was coming out about teen marijuana use and schizophrenia. And we both were very frustrated that this just was not common knowledge. And so I asked him if he wanted to share his story to help warn other people about this, and he said yes. And so together we wrote a novella, A Night in Jail, and it's equal parts fiction and nonfiction so that we could get a good story going in there. All the stories that are told in it are true. They're his life stories, but the plot is fictional so that we could get some momentum. It's told from the point of view of a young man about to enter college, and he's forced to spend the night in jail because he got busted for smoking pot. And his cellmate is a homeless drug addict with schizophrenia who keeps him awake all night long with his delusions. And the kid cannot stand the guy, but by the time morning comes, his world is completely turned upside down. So it's our goal to get the book into schools so that there can be discussions with teenagers about all of the issues, because as Faye told you in the introduction, his life really illustrates all of the pitfalls, not just mental illness, but all of the pitfalls of teen drug use. Additionally, it's our goal that when kids discuss the issues, that they also look up the latest scientific research and talk about that as well. Because not enough people are talking about this risk with teen marijuana use. People don't want to believe it. Parents don't want to believe it. I was at a juvenile detention facility a couple months ago talking about the link about my psychotic experience when I couldn't remember where I was, who I was with. I was back and forth, and this young lady shouted at me. She said, "That wasn't marijuana you were smoking." Oh. And I said, "That's why I'm here. That's exactly why I'm here. Because now you guys have heard it. Some way, if you don't believe it, that's one thing, but now at least someone has told you this." There is an addiction center here in the South Bay, and they are getting more and more young men who are having psychotic experiences. They're disconnected from reality, and the only thing they've done was marijuana. And they're like, the parents are like, "Well, it's just marijuana, it's fine." And so and they don't know what to do with them. They don't know how to medicate these young men. They don't even know if they can get them back, but it was just marijuana. People say, well, look, if it did cause a mental illness, how come we didn't hear about it? Because people were smoking in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And Dr. Christine Miller, who was a neuroscientist and schizophrenia researcher, said the reason for that is because no one was studying it back then. This is only 30 years worth of studies. Since every teenager who uses cannabis is not going to get a mental illness, what are the things that increase the risk? 1, early age of onset. So 12 was not good. Every year a person can delay using marijuana specifically and alcohol, they save themselves years of addiction and other problems. So 12 was not good. Frequency of use. How often is it being used? Regular use, really bad. And genetic predisposition. This is a dangerous one to throw out there. Dr. Miller says that 10% of the population has a predisposition to mental illness, psychosis in particular, and they don't know it because it could be somewhere in their tree. A great uncle, and not everybody in the family gets it, but maybe this one does. And now there's one more additional risk factor, which makes this book even more important from when my brother and I started writing this. It's not just THC, it's the high potency THC that is on the market today that is an additional risk factor. Remember, Dr. Jensen says regular use of THC will increase your risk for psychosis and schizophrenia by 2 times. Well, there's skunk out there. I'm sure you've smelt it. It smells like a skunk. And that is so much stronger. And there was a study done in the British Journal of Psychiatry last March. It was just published. And they said regular users of skunk increase their risk by 4 times for psychosis and schizophrenia. The lead author of the study says, it's incontrovertible that heavy use of cannabis increases the risk of psychosis, and high-potency preparations and synthetic cannabinoids carry the greater risk. Those are the dabs, the oils, the candies, the cookies, the sodas. A soda bottle, 1 serving out of the soda bottle is 1/10. What kid is going to have 1/10 of a soda bottle or 1 little square out of a candy bar? People are having accidental overdoses of these things. Additionally, they showed MRIs of the brains of regular users of skunk, and their brains had shrunk vital parts of the brain had shrunk by 11%. The lead author goes on to say that the United States has embarked on a major pharmaceutical experiment with the brains of our youth, and that Britain should sit back and watch and see what happens in our country before they do anything, and he scolds their government for not making this information more aware to their people. So in conclusion, my brother and I had a lot of fun with drugs and alcohol, but we believe we're still paying that price today for the fun that we had. I'm grateful to report that my brother is now living in a group home. He's been sober this time for 22 months and he's doing really well. He loves the book, and he says if it prevents one kid from making the same mistakes he did, then he will be gratified. So let's tell everyone what my brother and I wish we knew when we were teenagers, that what seems like harmless fun might actually ruin their lives.
Questions?
Everybody. So it seems to me that since the big effort for legalization
Yeah.
has been so successful, and
Yeah.
you know, there's obviously a lot of money behind
Yes.
that whole thing.
Yes.
The voices like yours have gotten smaller in
Yes.
the last several years. So is there any kind of organization that's bigger that's trying to get that kind of word out?
Yes, there's Smart Approaches to Marijuana is a nonpartisan group out of Washington, and it's started by the drug czar
Washington,
for
D.C.?
Washington D.C. Yes, yes. Kevin Sabet was a drug czar for Obama, and Patrick Kennedy of the Kennedys was also a founder. Dr. Christine Miller, who I quote, she is one of their scientists, and Eric Fromm, who is a speechwriter. They're nonpartisan, and all they want is scientific research. And they're fine with legalization, but they say you just have to put it through the same process as every other drug that's out there. And definitely not for teenagers. Everybody knows, even the proponents of legalization know that it's not for teenagers. But as we were talking about, these vaping flavors are in strawberry and bubblegum and
Just enticing young people.
yes,
Yeah.
gummy bears. They're enticing, they're getting teens addicted young, and they're also, it is a big marijuana industry, just like you discussed, which is mimicking big tobacco. And in fact, they are working together now. I think some of the tobacco and marijuana companies are merging. So they're all too familiar with how to get young people addicted. Yes.
Any other
Anybody?
questions?
Okay,
That was excellent.
awesome. Thank you so much.
Heidi,
Thank you.
name of the Hermosa Beach Rotary Club and older Rotary, and like just a little souvenir from us. And
Oh,
thank you so much for coming.
I love it. Thank
Hermosa
you.
Beach Club. Thank you
Okay,
so much.
awesome. Thank you.
Oh, picture?
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
We have paparazzi
Okay,
here.
and so Nick,
Oh,
could you
here.
take a picture as well?
No,